The first time I died, my mother was saying a word. Her voice, the one I'd lost when I was small, the one I'd spent 30 years failing to remember the exact sound of, came up out of the dark giving me a word the way she used to, slow and careful and loving, the way you hand a child something precious and breakable. And I went to spell it the way I always had as a girl, letter by letter into the quiet, the way she taught me before she was gone. And I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't make the letters. The word hung there in the dark between us, her gift, the thing she left me, the only thing of hers I ever really had, and for the first time in my whole life I had no way to say it. I was 43 years old, dying quietly in my sleep of a thing my body had hidden from me, alone in a small gray apartment, and the gift my mother gave me with her last good years, the love of words, the joy of them, the one thing that was wholly mine, had sat unused on a shelf for 30 years, silent, the way I'd been silent, and now her voice was giving me one last word, and I had no voice left to spell it back. The dark came up soft, and the word dissolved before I could catch it, and the last thing I knew was the terrible quiet of a woman who'd spent her whole life with her words unspoken, dying with one more she'd never get to say. Here is the cruelty of it, the thing I carried out of that quiet and across into a second life. I had a gift for words. Not a child who was good at spelling tests. I mean the real thing, the rare thing, the kind of ear and memory and love for language that comes along seldom. Words lived in me, their shapes and sounds and secret histories, the way they fit together and where they came from and how they were spelled, and I could hold them and turn them and take them apart and put them back together the way other children built with blocks. My mother gave me that. She loved words. She'd been going to be something with them, a teacher or a writer before I came and before she got sick. And in the few short years I had her, she poured words into me like she knew her time was short, read to me, spelled with me, gave me her own dictionary with my name written next to hers inside the cover, taught me that a word was a small perfect thing you could always carry and no one could ever take. And then she was gone, and the words were all I had left of her, the one inheritance, the one place she still lived. And I spent the back half of my first life with that gift in a closet and her dictionary unopened on a shelf, the woman who could have done anything with words doing nothing with them at all, silent, small, unspoken, because when I was 11 years old, the woman who replaced my mother looked me in the eye and told me to lose on purpose, to bomb the one competition where my gift could shine, so that her real daughter could lift the trophy instead. And I learned at 11, the lesson that ran my whole life, that being good was dangerous, that shining cost you love, that the way to be wanted in that house was to make yourself small and spell the word wrong on purpose. And then I opened my eyes, and my mother's dictionary wasn't on a far shelf gathering dust. It was real, in my small hands, open on my lap, and I was 11 years old, the morning of the bee, alive. Let me tell you who I was, because you can't understand the size of what I gave away unless you understand what words were for me, and what it is to be a motherless child in a house that has decided you don't quite count. My mother died when I was 7. For a few years after, it was just me and my father, and he was a kind man but a quiet one, and grief made him quieter, made him fold up small inside himself, and so a lot of the raising of me happened in the gap she left, and into that gap I poured words. The dictionary was my company. I read it the way other kids read storybooks, found the strange ones and the beautiful ones, and the ones with secret rooms inside them, learned the histories of where words came from, and somewhere in all that reading I discovered that I had her gift, the ear and the memory and the love, that words came to me and stayed, and let me hold them. I want to be specific about what that gift was and why it saved me, because it's the whole of who I am and the whole of what made me a child who could be broken. A word, to me, was never just a thing you said. It was a small, perfect machine with a history, a little sealed world. You could open it and find the Latin or the Greek or the old forgotten tongue curled up inside it, find why it was spelled the strange way it was spelled, find the cousins it had in other languages, find the logic hiding under what looked like chaos. Rhythm and rhyme are cousins. Mortgage has a dead Frenchman buried in its silent letters. Island has an S that doesn't belong, smuggled in by scholars who got the history wrong. I knew these things at 9, not because anyone made me learn them, but because they were beautiful, because each one was a tiny door into a room where my mother still was. She'd loved exactly this, the secret machinery of words, and every door I opened a little nearer to her. The gift wasn't memorization. It was love, inherited, the only thing she had time to leave me before she was gone. And here is why it mattered so much, why it became the whole of me. Because everywhere else in that house I didn't count, and the words were the one place I did. In the kitchen, at the dinner table, in the daily weather of the family, I was the lesser child, the reminder, the one whose feelings could be overlooked. But inside a word, none of that reached me. A word didn't know I was the dead wife's daughter. A word didn't care that I wasn't the favorite. A word was spelled right or it was spelled wrong, and either I knew it or I didn't, and the knowing was mine, untouchable, a thing no one in that house could take or diminish or give to Paige instead. The words were the one room in my life with a lock on the door, and inside it my mother was still alive, and I was still loved, and I was undeniably the best, and you can perhaps already see why a woman who needed me dimmed would come, eventually, for exactly that room. It wasn't schoolwork. It was where my mother still was. Every word I learned a little closer to her. Remember that the words were never about winning. They were about her. They were the one place she wasn't gone. And then my father, lonely and grieving and not built to raise a girl alone, married Marlene. And Marlene came with a daughter, Paige, a few months younger than me, and the four of us became a household. And I learned quickly, the way children learn the weather of a house, exactly where I stood in it. Marlene loved Paige with the whole fierce front of her, and Marlene could not love me, and I don't think she ever tried very hard to hide which was which. I was the dead first wife's daughter, the reminder, the one who didn't belong to her, the cuckoo in the nest, and worse, I was good at the one thing her own daughter wasn't, because Paige was an ordinary sweet kid with no particular gift for words, and I was the real thing, and my being the real thing sat in that house like an accusation. Marlene wanted her daughter to shine, and I, just by being what my mother made me, dimmed her. So Marlene set about, in 100 small daily ways, teaching me my place, the praise that always went to Paige, the accomplishments of mine that somehow never got mentioned at dinner, the slow, steady lesson that in this house, my gift was not a thing to be proud of, but a thing to apologize for. And I, a motherless girl who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be loved by the woman who'd taken my mother's place, learned to apologize for it, learned to dim myself, learned that the way to maybe, someday, be counted in that house was to never, ever outshine Paige. Remember the wanting. The wanting to be loved by her is the lever the whole thing turns on. The word was the heart of it, the act of spelling, of taking a word into your mouth and giving it back letter by perfect letter, the most intimate thing you can do with language. If you've ever loved words, you know the particular joy of it. The word given to you, the quick, bright cascade of recognition, the shape of it assembling in your mind, the letters coming one after another clean and certain and right, and the small total satisfaction of a word spelled true. I lived for that. And the microphone. Standing at the microphone in front of everyone, the word given, the whole room holding its breath, and me, the small, overlooked girl, giving the word back perfect. That was the one place in my whole life where I was not invisible, where I was undeniably, publicly, beautifully the best, where my mother's gift made me shine in front of the world. Remember the word. Remember the spelling, letter by letter. Remember my mother's voice, giving me words in the dark. They're where this whole thing is spelled out, and they're what I gave away, and they're what I came back to take. And then there was the B, and I learned that the people who can break a child sometimes do it by asking very gently for the child to break herself. Now I have to tell you about the spelling bee, because it's the center of everything. It wasn't a little classroom thing. It was the big regional bee, the prestigious one, the one that drew the best young spellers from across the whole region with a real trophy and a scholarship and, for the winner, a place at the national championship, the kind of stage that gets a kid's name in the paper and changes how the world sees her. For most of the children, it was a competition. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the one place I would be seen, really seen, in front of my father and the whole town, undeniably the best at the one thing my dead mother gave me. It was my chance to make my father proud, to maybe, finally, be counted. It was my mother's gift carried up onto a stage and shown to the world. I need you to understand what a stage like that is to a child who has been made invisible at home, because it's the whole engine of how much it could hurt me. Every day in that house, I was the lesser one, the overlooked one, the one whose accomplishments evaporated before they reached the dinner table. And here, finally, was a place where that couldn't happen, a stage, a microphone, a whole town watching, and an outcome no one in my house could control or reassign or hand to Paige instead. On that stage, the gift would be undeniable. My father would have to see it. The town would have to see it. Marlene would have to see it. For one bright hour, the truth of me would be too public to overlook, and the dead wife's daughter would stand in the light and be, plainly, the best, and that, of course, was exactly the danger, because the one outcome Marlene could not survive was the whole town watching me shine in the spot where Paige was supposed to. I had been the clear favorite all year. Everyone who'd watched the rounds knew it. The gift my mother left me was about to shine where everyone could see. And that was precisely the problem, because the one thing Marlene could not bear was for the dead wife's daughter to lift the trophy while her own Paige, a sweet, ordinary speller who'd scraped into the finals, stood in the crowd and watched. The night before the bee, in my first life, Marlene came into my room for the conversation she'd been building toward. She sat on the edge of my bed, and she used the soft voice, the almost kind voice, the one I'd spent years aching to hear pointed at me, and she said, "Edie, sweetheart, I want to talk to you about tomorrow, about Paige." And my heart leapt a little, foolishly, the way a starved child's heart leaps at any warmth from the person whose love she wants most. You know how much this means to her. She's worked so hard, and she doesn't have what you have. She's not gifted like you. Everyone knows you're the special one, and this is her one chance to have a moment of her own. You'll have 100 more chances. You're brilliant. You'll always be brilliant. The world is going to hand you everything. But Paige needs this. So here's what I'm asking you to do, and I'm asking because you're a good girl and you love this family. And here she did the thing, the soft pivot, the longed-for warmth turned into a blade. Lose tomorrow. On purpose. Miss a word early, let yourself go out, and let Paige win the trophy. Do it for your sister. Do it for me. And I promise you, I will be so proud of you for it. And then the ask, the one that is the title of my whole story, delivered with the terrible gentleness of a woman who has dressed her own favoritism up as a child's chance to finally be loved. Bomb the spelling bee so my daughter lifts the trophy. My daughter. I want you to hear those 2 words, because they were the whole knife. I sat there, a motherless 11-year-old in a house where I'd spent 4 years trying to be counted, and the woman I most wanted to love me looked at me and said my daughter, and meant Paige, meant that in this house there was one daughter, and it was not me, that I was the one who could be asked to lose, the one whose shining could be spent, the one who didn't quite count. And the deeper cruelty, the one I'd only understand fully when I was grown and dead and reborn, was that she was asking me to throw away the one thing of my mother's I had left. She had taken my mother's place in the house. Now she was asking me to extinguish my mother's gift on a public stage, so her own daughter could shine in the space where I went dark. And she'd found the one lover a motherless child has no defense against. The promise, finally, of her approval, the chance to at last be a good girl she'd be proud of, the desperate hope that if I just made myself small enough, lost on purpose sweetly enough, she might finally love me, and she used it to ask me to spell the word wrong on purpose. And I did it. God forgive the child I was, but how could she have done anything else? I did it. The next day, at the Big B, under the lights, at the microphone, with my father in the audience and the trophy gleaming on its table, I was given an early word, an easy one, a word I'd known cold since I was 8, and I stood there, and I spelled it wrong on purpose. I remember the exact moment in that first life because it's the moment I most needed to come back and undo. The word was given, and my mother's voice came up around it the way it always did, certain and loving, handing me the letters, and I stood there and refused them. I said a letter I knew was wrong, on purpose, into the microphone, in front of everyone, and the feeling of it was like betraying her to her face. It was the single hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done it twice now, failed on purpose and watched myself fail on purpose, and I can tell you that nothing in either life cost me what that cost. Because I wasn't just losing a bee. I was taking the one gift my dead mother had time to give me, the one room where she still lived, and I was spitting in it on a public stage for a woman who would never, ever love me, and some part of me, even at 11, even drunk on the hope of Marlene's approval, knew it, felt the wrongness of it go through me like cold water, and did it anyway, because a starving child will burn anything for the promise of a meal. And the little bell rang, the soft, terrible bell that means you're out, and I walked off the stage a deliberate failure at the one thing I was born to do. And Paige, with the real competition gone, spelled her way through the weaker field that remained and lifted the trophy, and Marlene wept with joy and pride for her daughter, and my father clapped, confused, and I, the best speller in that whole region, the keeper of my mother's gift, got nothing, and walked home in the dark having learned the lesson that would run my entire life, that being excellent had cost me, that shining was dangerous, that the way to be loved was to lose. And Marlene never said she was proud of me. That's the part that finished me. I'd thrown away my mother's gift for the promise of her approval, and the approval never came. A quick, distracted, good girl, that night, and never another word about it, because of course there was nothing to be proud of. I'd done a shameful thing, and we both knew it, and you cannot be proud of a child for the favor of disappearing. The promise had been a lie, the way they always are. And something in me, at 11, simply folded shut. There were not 100 more chances, and the lesson did not stay contained to one bee. That's the thing about a wound that deep at an age that young. It becomes the shape of you. I had learned, in the most formative year of my life, taught by the adult whose love I needed most, that my gift made me unlovable, that being the best was a kind of theft, that safety and affection lived in smallness and self-erasure. And I built my whole life on that lesson. Let me stay in that ruin a moment, because the way it spread is the part nobody warns you about, the part that's worse than one lost trophy. A wound to a grown person stays mostly where you put it. A wound to a child at 11 gets built into the foundation, and everything you become after is built on top of it, crooked. I didn't just throw one bee. I learned a rule about how the world worked and how love was earned, and I obeyed that rule for 30 years without ever once examining it, because it had been installed too early and too deep to question. The rule was, shining costs you love, so don't shine. And so I didn't. When a teacher singled out my writing, I felt not pride but a flush of danger, the old 11-year-old alarm. You're being too much, someone's going to make you pay for this, and I'd pull back, turn in something smaller next time. When I was offered things, a place in an advanced program, a chance to compete, a scholarship interview, I found reasons to decline because reaching for what I was good at felt like the prelude to being punished for it. I made myself agreeable and unthreatening and small, the girl who never put herself forward, and people called it modesty, and it was not modesty. It was a child still trying not to outshine Paige, decades after Paige had stopped competing because the rule didn't know time had passed. And so the gift went dark. I drifted through a gray series of small jobs that asked nothing of the thing my mother gave me: filing, data entry, transcription, rooms full of other people's forms. The woman who could have written books or taught children to love language, spending her days in silent rote work that used nothing of her, because I'd been taught that using my gift was a betrayal of the people I needed to love me. I never married, never quite let anyone all the way in because closeness meant being seen, and being seen had only ever ended one way. I told myself I was just private, just steady, just a person who liked a quiet life, and underneath all of it the words waited, unspoken, my mother's voice in them, getting fainter every year. I refused to listen. And my mother's dictionary sat on a shelf, the most precious thing I owned and the most untouched, because to open it was to remember that I'd once thrown her gift into the dirt on a stage for a woman who never loved me anyway, and that was a thing I could not bear to remember. So I left the dictionary closed and the words unspoken, and the room where my mother lived locked for 30 years, while my one life went quietly by. And at 43, alone in a small gray apartment, my body, which had been hiding something from me, the way bodies do, simply stopped in my sleep, and my mother's voice gave me one last word out of the dark, and I had no voice left to spell it. And then I opened my eyes, and the dictionary was real in my small hands, my name written next to my mother's inside the cover, and I was 11 years old, in my old room, the morning of the bee. I did not cry, and I'll be straight with you about that, because the soft version has an 11-year-old weeping over a dictionary, and the real version is stranger and harder, because I was 11 and 43 at once. A grown woman's whole ruined life poured into a child's small body, and what moved through me was not a child's confusion but a woman's clarity, terrible and total. I had thrown away my mother's gift to be loved by a woman who would never love me, and I had been handed, against every law of God and time, the chance to spell the word right. The strangeness of it nearly undid me, that first hour, because nobody tells you what it is to be your grown self and your child self at the same time, in the same small body, in the house where it all went wrong. I looked at my small hands, and they were a child's hands. I looked in the mirror, and a round 11-year-old face looked back, a face I'd spent decades forgetting, the face from before the bee broke it. I heard Marlene moving in the kitchen and felt the old child's flinch run through me, the automatic bracing, and underneath it the grown woman's cold, clear knowledge of exactly what that woman was and exactly what she would ask tonight. I knew the whole future. Knew Paige would be sweet and ordinary, knew my father would stay folded up and grieving, knew Bertie and Miss Hadley and the gray decades and the small apartment and the unspelled word, knew all of it, carried all of it, in a body that came up to a grown-up's elbow. For that hour I half expected, every time I blinked, to wake back in the gray apartment with my mother's voice fading and the dark coming up. But the dictionary was warm and real in my small hands, and her voice came up out of its pages every time I opened it, and slowly the strangeness settled into the one hard certainty underneath, that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, the morning of the bee, and that I was not going to spend it dazed. I had a word to spell. More than that, I had my mother's gift to take back out of the dirt I'd thrown it in, and a microphone to finally stand at as the speller I actually was. And underneath the clarity, lower down, was something that broke me open, because I could hear her again. I opened the dictionary with my small hands and read a word, and my mother's voice came up around it, the way it used to, giving it to me slow and careful and loving, and I made a sound I'd never made in either life, because I'd spent 30 years failing to remember the exact sound of her voice, and now here it was, here she was, in the words, the way she always had been, waiting in the place I'd abandoned. Even if the bee had been gone forever, I think I'd have wept just for that, for her voice, for the words, for the one place my mother wasn't gone. The revenge, whatever it became, was always going to run second to that. The first thing was that I had my mother back in the words. Everything else came from refusing, this time, to spell them wrong. The morning before the bee was strange and vivid, and the strangest part was all of them being alive and unwritten again. Marlene, almost kind and not yet exposed. Paige, sweet and ordinary and not yet a pawn I understood. My father, quiet and folded up and grieving, whom I'd half lost in another life. The dictionary warm in my hands. I moved through that morning like a woman rereading the worst page of her life, finding every place the first telling had gone wrong. I went to my father first, and this is a thing I never did the first time, and it mattered more than I knew. My father was a kind man drowned in grief and remarriage, a man who'd folded up so small after my mother died that he'd stopped seeing what was happening to me in his own house, and in my first life I'd lost him to that fog, and never reached him, and he'd died years before me a stranger. So in my second life, I found him that morning, alone in the kitchen, and I did the thing an 11-year-old wouldn't think to do, but a 43-year-old desperately would. I climbed into his lap the way I hadn't since I was little, and I said, "Daddy, will you watch me spell today? Really watch." And something moved in his fogged face, some old buried thing, and he held me and said, "Of course I will, Edie. I always watch." And I said, "Mum used to give me words." I can still hear her, when I read the dictionary. And my father, who never talked about her, who'd buried her so deep he'd buried me with her, got tears in his eyes and said, "Lo, you have her gift. You know that?" exactly her gift. Watching you spell is like, and he couldn't finish, and he didn't have to. It was the first time in either life he'd said it. And I understood, holding my quiet grieving father, that he had never been my enemy, that he'd been a casualty too, a kind man too broken to protect me, and that some of what I'd lost in the first life I could still reach, if I just reached. Remember that. It changes the ending. There were two other people I let in that morning a little, and they were the reason I made it. The first was Bertie, my friend, a loud, funny, fiercely loyal kid from school who'd appointed herself my person somewhere back in the early grades and never wavered, who didn't care about spelling and cared enormously about me, and who'd seen, with a child's clear, cruel accuracy, exactly what my house was. In my first life I'd lost Bertie too, after the bee, pulled away from everyone, the way you do when you've been taught that being seen is dangerous, and a friend is someone who sees you. So that morning I found her, walking to the hall, and when she said, the way she always did, "You're gonna destroy them today, right? You're gonna spell every single one." I didn't give her the small deflecting answer the old me would have given. I said, "Yeah, I am." And Bertie, who had no idea she was witnessing a resurrection, just grinned and said, "Good. Because your stepmom's been telling everyone Paige is gonna win, and it makes me want to scream, because everyone knows it's you, Edie. It's so obviously you." Out of the mouth of a kid, the whole truth, plainly. I kept Bertie this time. She was at my wedding, decades later, still loud, still my person. And the second was Ms. Hadley, the school librarian, the one adult outside my mother who'd ever truly seen the gift, a warm, sharp woman who'd watched me work my way through her whole word section and had quietly started leaving harder books where I'd find them. She caught me in the hall before the bus and crouched down and said, "Lo, just for me. I'll be there today in the audience. And I want you to know something in case nobody at home has said it. What you can do with words is rare. I've been a librarian a long time. I don't say it lightly." In my first life she'd been there too, and she'd watched me spell an easy word wrong on purpose and walk off the stage, and something in her had gone quietly heartbroken, because she'd known, a woman who loved words that much always knows, that she'd just watched a real gift be thrown away, and she could never prove it or fix it. This time she'd watched me spell it true. I never told her she was the reason I believed at 11 that the gift was worth keeping. But she was. I did not confront Marlene that morning, and people always ask why I didn't expose her the moment I woke up knowing what she was. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because I was an 11-year-old child, and a child confronting a parent is a child who loses every time. Marlene was the adult, fluent in the language of the long-suffering stepmother doing her best with a difficult girl, and any accusation I made would be turned, instantly, into proof that I was jealous, ungrateful, troubled, acting out, and my fogged father would believe her, because believing her was easier than waking up. The one move she had no answer to was a child who simply, quietly, was no longer available to lose on purpose. So I gave her nothing to push against. I was sweet, I was the good girl she expected, and inside I was a sealed book she couldn't read, and I let her walk toward the be certain that the child she'd asked to bomb it had quietly, permanently, decided to spell. And I watched Paige because Paige was the innocent at the center of it, and I needed to see her clear with my second life eyes. And here's what I saw, the thing my child's hurt had blurred the first time. Paige was just a kid. A sweet, ordinary, not especially gifted kid who loved her mother and wanted to make her proud, exactly like I did, and who had no idea, none, that her mother had gone behind the scenes and asked me to throw the bee so she could win. Marlene hadn't told Paige. Paige thought she was entering a spelling bee to do her best, the way you do. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't even unkind to me. Not really. We were two girls in the same sad house, and on her good days Paige was almost a sister to me. She was about to be handed an unfair victory by her own mother, without her knowledge, and she'd be no more guilty of it than I'd been guilty of being good. Remember that. It's why what happened to Paige was something a child could survive, and why I never blamed her, and why the only person who deserved a break that day was the grown woman who'd arranged the whole thing. Paige was never the villain. Paige was just the daughter Marlene loved, used as the excuse to break the daughter she didn't. The morning of the bee, Marlene found me one last time, exactly as I knew she would, with the ask she'd built toward. She caught me by the door in my good dress, and she crouched down to my level and used the soft, warm voice, and she said, "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. Remember, Paige. Be a good girl today. Lose for your sister, and I'll be so proud of you. Do it for me." I looked at her, this woman whose love I'd been starving for, who was asking me to starve a little more, and I felt the weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, in my small, clear child's voice, the truest thing I ever said in that house. "No, I'm going to spell my best today. Every word. If Paige can win with me spelling my best, then she's the better speller and I'll clap for her. But I'm not getting a word wrong on purpose, so she doesn't have to beat me." The look that crossed Marlene's face was a thing I'll remember as long as I can hold a word. She'd never heard it from me. Not from the good girl. Not from the motherless child who'd do anything for a scrap of her love. And the soft warmth fell off her like a mask, and what was underneath was cold and old and ugly. "After everything I've done for you? Taking you in, raising you when I didn't have to. This is how you repay this family, by being selfish, by stealing your sister's one moment because your ego can't stand to let her have something? I knew you were like this. Your mother's daughter." And there it was, your mother's daughter, said like a curse, the cruelest thing she could reach for, and it should have unmade me, the way it would have unmade the child I'd been, because a motherless girl will do almost anything not to lose the love she's begging for. But I wasn't only that child anymore. I died alone at 43 with my mother's gift in a closet, and her voice giving me a word I couldn't spell. So I said, in my small, steady voice, "Yes, I am my mother's daughter. She gave me words, and I'm not going to throw them away for you." And I walked out the door and I went to the B and I spelled. Here's the part Marlene never understood, the mechanism under the whole thing, and I'll lay it out plain because it's the engine of everything. A spelling bee is the most honest contest there is for a child. You're given a word, and you spell it right or you spell it wrong, in front of everyone, and there's no luck and no favor and no judge's opinion. The word is the word, and either you know it or you don't. The last speller standing wins. In my first life, by bombing it, I didn't do anything to Paige. I simply removed the best speller from the field. Who'd have outlasted everyone, walked off the stage on purpose on an easy early word, and with me gone, Paige spelled her way past the remaining weaker children and lifted the trophy, not because she was good enough to beat me, but because I'd taken myself out of her way. My deliberate failure was the entire margin. The day I spelled my best, the margin came back. I stood at that microphone and spelled every word true, the way my mother taught me, all the way to the end. And Paige, spelling against a real field instead of a field with its best speller gone, went out on word 4. Her 4th word. She misspelled it and the bell rang and she sat down, early, the way she always would have if the best speller had ever actually competed. She didn't go out because I did anything to her. She went out because I stopped doing something for her. I stopped spelling the word wrong so hers would look like enough. I'll tell you about the bee, because in my first life I bombed it, and spelling it true in my second was a resurrection with a microphone and my mother's voice. The hall was full and bright, the spellers in a row on the stage, the trophy on its table, my father in the audience really watching for the first time. And when my turn came and the pronouncer gave me my first word, the thing happened that always happened, the thing I'd starved for across 30 silent years. My mother's voice came up around the word, the way it used to, slow and careful and loving, and I gave the word back to her, letter by perfect letter, into the microphone, into the bright room, in front of everyone. And the joy of it, the joy of being seen, of standing in the light and being undeniably, publicly the best at the one thing my mother gave me, nearly lifted me off my feet. The words came and I spelled them. The easy ones and the hard ones and the strange, beautiful ones with secret histories I'd read about in my mother's dictionary, and with each one the room saw me a little more, the small, overlooked girl with a gift, and I was not invisible. I was not the one who didn't count. I was Edie, my mother's daughter, spelling her gift into the light. There's a thing that happens to me at a microphone with a hard word, that happened to me then, that I'd forgotten across 30 years of silence. The whole rest of the world goes quiet. The lights, the crowd, the woman in the third row who told me to lose, and there's only the word, given to me, and the secret machinery of it, and my mother's voice somewhere in it, and the clean total task of giving it back true. They'd give me a word, and I'd ask its language of origin, and its root the way she taught me, not because I needed to, but because it was the ritual, the way of taking a word apart to find the spelling hiding in its history, and then I'd spell it, and the small bright certainty of each one spelled true was the purest happiness I'd felt in 2 lifetimes. I want to be honest, there was one word, near the end, that I had to fight for, that I didn't know cold, and I stood there and listened for her voice, and took the word apart by its roots the way she taught me, found my way to it letter by careful letter, and got it because even the real thing has to fight sometimes, and I'd rather show you a girl who works for a hard word than one who never sweats. But I spelled them all, every one, all the way to the last, and when the final word was given and I spelled it true, and the trophy was mine, I looked out and found my father on his feet with tears on his face, really seeing me, and at the side of the hall the school librarian, Miss Hadley, who'd always known what I was, pressed her hand to her heart, because in another life I'd made them watch me throw it away. And in this one I'd spelled my mother's gift true in front of the world. And Paige, for words in, had gone out, sweetly and ordinarily, the way a sweet, ordinary speller does against a real field, and sat back down beside her mother, no more harmed than any child who doesn't want to be, already half over it the way kids are. And then Marlene broke. It happened as the trophy was put in my hands, as the room applauded the dead wife's daughter, as it became undeniable that I had won and Paige had gone out early, and the whole careful arrangement had collapsed in the most public possible way. And I watched the realization move across Marlene's face in stages. First the certainty it was wrong, that surely I'd lose, that the good girl would do as she was told. Then the dawning horror as I spelled word after word, and Paige sat down on the 4th. Then, slowly, the understanding that there was nothing to be done, that can't be appealed, that her daughter had been revealed, in front of the whole town, as the ordinary speller she'd always been, and the trophy was going to the child she couldn't love, lifted by the gift of the dead woman she'd replaced. And then her face did the thing. It cracked, the long, careful performance of the patient stepmother falling away, because she'd just understood that Paige's victory had never existed except in the space my deliberate failure made, and the 1 year I refused, her daughter went out on word 4. I knew that face, though I'd never worn it myself. I'd worn its slow inside-out version. Across 30 gray years, the long, quiet collapse of a person watching the thing they'd built on a lie come apart. Marlene was having that whole collapse in 1 public minute. She had staked everything on a single bet, that the dead wife's daughter would keep choosing the leash, would keep spelling the word wrong for the hope of a love Marlene had no intention of ever paying out, and the bet had just failed in front of the entire town, and there was nothing underneath it. No real victory for Paige, no real superiority, no ground to stand on, only the exposed fact of a woman who'd tried to dim a motherless child and been caught doing it in the brightest possible light. It was not a child's collapse. Paige had taken her small loss like a child, already half over it. It was the grown woman's collapse, the architect of the whole thing, watching her scheme implode and her favoritism exposed, and the gift she'd tried to extinguish blazing up in front of everyone in the hands of the girl she'd tried to dim. And the town saw it. That was the part she could never undo. The town had watched her tell everyone Paige would win, and the town had just watched Paige go out on word 4 while the stepdaughter spelled like something out of a dream, and a town does its own quiet arithmetic about a woman like that, and the answer is not kind, and there is no appeal. I did not go to her. I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't cross the hall and explain that Paige had gone out by the exact measure of the failure I'd refused, this time, to perform. I was a child holding a trophy with my mother's voice still warm around the last word, and I let Marlene break in her seat, because her breaking was not a thing a child should have to fix, and never had been. The only thing I'd done was spell my best and decline for 1B, to throw away my mother's gift so her daughter wouldn't have to be as good as me. The rest she'd done herself, the night she sat on a motherless child's bed and dressed her own cold favoritism up as that child's last chance to be loved. And Paige, in the days after, was just a kid who'd lost a spelling bee, and the most telling thing of all was how little she'd ever needed the win. She came up to me at some point with the easy short memory of childhood and said, "You're really good. Like really, really good. Mom said you weren't going to try hard, but you tried so hard." And there it was, in a child's mouth, the small accidental confirmation that her mother had told her some version of the lie, had arranged the whole thing around her without her knowing. Paige wasn't cruel and she wasn't crushed. She was a sweet, ordinary kid who'd have been fine either way, who'd never asked to be made the excuse for breaking me. She and I were never close, exactly. Too much sad weather in that house for that, but I never blamed her, and when we were grown we made a quiet peace. Two girls who'd both been used, one to shine and one to dim, by a woman who could only love in that one fierce, narrow way. The daughter Marlene held up as the reason I should disappear turned out to be another kid Marlene had failed, just more flatteringly than she'd failed me. Marlene came to find me a few days later. Not gently, not to apologize, because Marlene didn't have that in her, but lost, the way they always end up. She wanted to understand how the good girl had defied her, how Paige had lost when the whole thing was arranged, and underneath the anger, she was genuinely uncomprehending, and her not understanding showed me the exact shape of the smallness that had ruined us both. So I told her, as much as a child can tell a grown woman, but I told her the true thing, the mechanism. I said, "You asked me to throw away the one thing of my mother's I have left, so Paige could win something she didn't earn. And you used the only thing I wanted for you to love me, to make me do it." But Paige was never the better speller. The only reason she ever won was that I lost on purpose. My bombing it was the whole margin. The one time I spelled my best, she went out on word for because that's how good she really is and you've always known it. You didn't make Paige a champion. You made me throw my mother's gift in the dirt for a trophy your daughter couldn't win on her own, and you promised me your love for it, and then you didn't even give me that. I was 11. I didn't say it as cleanly as a woman would, but I said the bones of it, and Marlene heard them. The word doesn't care whose daughter you are. It's spelled right or it's spelled wrong, and no mother's favorite gets the letters changed for her. The one time I refused to spell it wrong, the truth came out, and the truth was word 4. She didn't have an answer. There was nothing to say. She looked at me like she was seeing something she'd worked hard never to see, that the dead wife's daughter had a gift she could neither match for her own child nor extinguish, and that she'd just been caught trying to do the second thing in front of the whole town. And I think some cold part of her understood, in that moment, that she hadn't lost control of me at the bee. She'd been losing it from the day she decided a motherless child's gift was a threat to be managed instead of a wonder to be loved, and the bee was just the day it came out into the light. She never asked me to lose for Paige again. And whatever passed for a relationship between us stayed cold and distant and clear-eyed from that day. No more pretending, which was, in its way, a relief, because the cruelest thing about my first life had been the pretending, the hope, the lever of a love that was never coming. With the pretending gone, at least I knew where I stood, and a child who knows where she stands can build something. I built it on my father and on Miss Hadley and on my friend Bertie and on the words. Not on Marlene. Never again on Marlene. I kept the trophy, and more than the trophy, I kept the lesson, the true one, the opposite of the one I'd learned the first time. Because here is what changed, the thing the whole second life turned on. An 11-year-old who spells her best and wins, instead of losing on purpose for a love that isn't coming, learns the opposite lesson, the saving one. She learns that her gift is hers, that being excellent is not a theft, that she does not have to make herself small to be worth loving, that the people who'd only love her small were never going to love her anyway, and the people worth having love her best when she shines. That lesson, learned at 11 instead of its poison twin, grew a completely different life. I grew up, and I became a person of words. Of course I did. The only thing that had ever stood between me and my mother's gift was a woman who taught me that using it was a betrayal, and the moment I stopped believing her, the gift was simply mine, the way it had always been. I became a writer. I wrote books, real ones people read, ones that reached into other lonely, overlooked kids the way books had reached into me, and I taught, and I spent my life among words in the place where my mother still lived, doing the things she'd been going to do before I came and before she got sick. And every book I wrote a little closer to her, the way every word I'd spelled as a girl had been a little closer to her. The woman who died silent in a gray apartment with her gift in a closet became a woman whose words were out in the world, read and loved, her voice, and through it, my mother's voice, finally, fully spoken. I dedicated the first book to her, just her name, and underneath it the line she used to say when she handed me a hard word. A word is a small perfect thing you can always carry, and no one can ever take it. She'd been wrong about that, in a way. Marlene had nearly taken it, had taken 30 years of it, and she'd been right about it in the end, because here it was carried all the way through death and back, spelled true at last. People would write to me sometimes about that dedication, strangers who'd had their own gift dimmed by someone who needed them small, and they'd say it had given them something back, and I'd think, this is what the gift was always for. Not the trophy. This. The words going out from me into them, the way they'd come into me from her, the chain of it unbroken now where it had nearly snapped on a stage when I was 11. The years after were the years I should have had, and I want to tell you about the thing that meant the most because it is in the books exactly. It's that I was loved and that I let myself be. My father, in this life, didn't fold all the way up and disappear because I'd climbed into his lap that morning and said, "Really watch me," and he had, and something in him woke up, and he became, late but truly, my father again, and we had years. Bertie, who'd seen me clearly when we were kids, stayed my friend for life. And eventually I let other people close, let myself be seen, married someone who loved the words and the woman who made them, because I'd unlearned the thing that taught me closeness was dangerous. I was both excellent and loved, and I need you to understand what a miracle that was, because the whole lie of my first life, the lie Marlene wrote into an 11-year-old, was that you had to choose, that being the best made you unlovable, that the price of shining was love. It was never true. I shone and I was loved, and the people who loved me more for the shining, not less, which is how you can always tell the real ones from the Marlenis. Some of what I came back for was never the trophy at all. It was that the simple, impossible fact of being fully myself and fully loved at the same time. And there was one more thing, the quietest. I never forgot what it is to be the gifted, overlooked child in a house that's decided you don't count, and I made myself, in 100 small ways, the opposite of Marlene. When I met a kid like that, the quiet, bright one being dimmed, the one whose gift was an inconvenience to the adults around her, I saw her, and I told her the truth, that her gift was hers, that she never had to lose to be loved, that the word doesn't care whose daughter she is. I judged a children's bee, some years, and I watched the rows of small faces for the one being told, by someone at home, to make herself small, and I tried to be for her the adult I'd needed and didn't have. I remember one in particular, a small, serious girl at a bee I judged, clearly the best in the room, who got an easy word in an early round and stood at the microphone, and I saw it, I knew it instantly, deliberately spelled it wrong. The same letter left out, the same little betrayal, the same too careful face. And after, I found her, and I crouched down to her level the way no one had crouched down to mine, and I didn't accuse her, and I didn't ask who told her to do it, because I knew there'd be a Marlene somewhere in the room. I just said, quietly, "You knew that word. I could tell. You know it cold." And her face did something, fear, and then a kind of terrible relief at being seen, and I said, "Whoever told you to lose, whatever they promised you for it, it's a lie. Your gift is yours. You never have to spell it wrong to be loved. The ones who'd only love you small were never going to love you anyway." She didn't say anything. She was 11. But I watched her at the next bee, the following year, and she spelled her best, every word, all the way to the end, and she won. And I watched a woman in the third row not clap, and I knew exactly what I'd done, and it was the closest thing to undoing my own first life I ever got. Some of what I came back for was them, too, the next overlooked child, told this time to spell her best. I saw Marlene one last time, years later, and it's the truest measure of how far the two roads ran apart. I was an established writer by then, a name, a woman whose words were in the world, back in the old town for something, and Marlene was old, diminished, a woman whose fierce, narrow love had curdled into a small, bitter life, page long grown and gone, and, I gathered, kept at something of a distance, because a love that can only burn for one thing in one way tends to burn its object out. She saw me, saw the woman I'd become, the books, the life, the unmistakable fact that the dead wife's daughter she'd tried to dim had become the brightest thing the town ever produced, and the old, complicated recognition crossed her face. She came over. She said my name, just my name, Edie, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old thing, the starving child's longing, the ache for her approval that had run my first whole life. And it wasn't there. Where it had been was just a clean, quiet space, because the wanting had finally, fully died, not in bitterness, but in completion, the way a hunger dies when you've been fed at last from better tables. There was a whole life out there with my name on it, books I hadn't written yet, a father I'd had years with, words waiting in the place my mother lived, and I was so completely full that there was nothing left in me to want from the woman who'd spent my childhood teaching me to starve. She tried to talk. She said something about how she'd always known I was special, how raising another woman's child is hard, how she'd done her best, how she hoped I understood the position she'd been in. It was the closest Marlene could come to an apology, and it still managed to be about her. And I noticed, listening, that I didn't need it, not the apology, not the admission, not even, anymore, her love. In my first life I'd have given anything for this woman to finally say she was proud of me. I'd have built a whole reconciliation on that scrap and been grateful for it. But I'd had my peace years before. The day I spelled my mother's gift true in front of the whole town, and my father stood up with tears on his face. I didn't need Marlene to love me. I was loved. I'd loved myself. So I let her finish, and I didn't argue, and I didn't accept it either. I just let it land in the air between us and dissolve. My mother gave me words. I said, gently, because it was the only thing that had ever been true between us. I'm a writer now. I spell them right. And I gave her a small, distant, final nod, not the eager, hungry look of the child who'd have thrown away anything for a scrap of her warmth. That child was at rest now, fed at last, gone with the gray apartment and the unspoken word of a life that no longer counts. And then I went back to my own life, my own words, my own people who loved me whole, and I left Marlene holding the memory of a child she'd told to spell it wrong, who had instead become a voice. I think about that night sometimes. The soft voice on the edge of my bed, the longed for warmth, the line, "Bomb the spelling bee so my daughter lifts the trophy. Do it for your sister, do it for me, and I'll be so proud of you." And how in one life I obeyed and threw away my mother's gift for a love that never came and died silent with the word unspelled. And in another life I refused and stood at the microphone and spelled my best. The whole divergence of two lives, the difference between a silent gray death and a voice out in the world, came down to a single word, the morning of a bee, spelled right instead of wrong. No. The smallest word, and the truest one I ever spelled. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the dark after my first death, the confrontations, the exposures, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to stand at a microphone and spell my best while the woman who told me to lose discovered, on word 4, what her daughter was worth without a better speller throwing the gift of her dead mother into the dirt. I never raised my voice, except to spell. I never did a thing to page. I just spelled my own words true and let the bell tell the truth. And it turned out the whole thing, Paige's trophy, Marlene's pride, all of it, had only ever been standing on my willingness to spell the word wrong, and the one time I refused, the truth came out, and the truth was word 4. I've thought a great deal, across 2 lives, about the particular lie Marlene wrote into me, because it's the lie that does the most damage to the most gifted children, and almost no one names it. It wasn't "you're not good enough." She couldn't use that one. The words wouldn't back her up, and I knew it. The lie she used was crueler and cleverer, and it was this: being good enough will cost you love. That you have to choose, that you can be excellent, or you can be loved, but not both, and that a good girl chooses love, chooses smallness, chooses to lose. It is the most efficient way in the world to disarm a gifted child, because you don't have to attack her gift at all. You just attach a price to it, the one price a child can't pay, and let her disarm herself, gratefully, believing she's being good. And here's the thing it took me dying to understand. The thing I'd tell every dimmed child if I could. It's a lie, root and branch. You do not have to choose. The people who'd only love you small were never going to love you anyway. Their love was the bait in the trap, not a real thing on offer. And the people who are actually capable of loving you will love you more for your shining, not less. The whole engine of my first ruin was a forced choice that didn't exist. I thought I was trading my gift for love, and I got neither because there was no love for sale at that price. There never is. The people who ask a child to be small so they can love her are not offering love. They're offering a leash. The real ones hand you the microphone. So no, I don't feel guilty that Paige went out on word for. I did nothing to Paige. I just stopped paying a price that was always a con, for a love that was never coming, and let myself be, for once, exactly as good as I was. Refusing to spell the word wrong is not cruelty to the people who needed you to lose. It only feels that way to the ones who'd built their whole arrangement on the certainty that you'd keep choosing the leash. The people who ask a child to lose on purpose, who dress it up as love, are almost always the ones who needed her to lose. I spelled a word wrong on purpose once, for a love that was never coming, and I died silent with my gift in a closet. I won't spell it wrong again. Not in this life, and if there's another after it, not in that one either. I'm spelling my best most days now, in a life made of words, my mother's voice never far when I read a beautiful one, the gift she gave me out in the world where she'd have wanted it. And every time I find the right word, the true one, the only one that fits, the letters falling into place clean and certain, I think about the woman who died silent with one last word she couldn't spell, the gift she'd given away at 11 for a love that never came, and I'm so grateful she got the chance to do it differently. Because that child at the microphone didn't just win back a trophy. She won back the words, her mother's voice, the one place that woman still lived, and the simple, total, hard-won fact of being a girl who spells her best and lets herself be loved for it, instead of a girl who spells it wrong on purpose to buy a love that isn't for sale. And she never, ever, threw away her mother's gift again. I think about the asking, sometimes, now that I've lived both answers, the obedient yes of a starving child and the steady no. People treat a thing like Marlene asked for as a small request, a kindness, a good girl being generous to her sister. But that was never what it was. The danger was never that someone would take my gift from me by force. Even a child can feel the difference between a thing taken and a thing surrendered. The danger was the cleverer thing, the thing a parent can do that no stranger can, to ask the child to throw the gift away herself, with her own small hands, and to call it love, and to make her believe that keeping it would make her selfish and unlovable. That's the trap they set for the gifted, overlooked child. Not theft, but the slow conversion of her own erasure into goodness, her own dimming into proof that she's a good girl who loves her family. And the only thing that ever frees a child from that trap is one other voice, a father who finally watches, a librarian who says this is rare, a loud, loyal friend who says everyone knows it's you, one true voice to set against the lie, so the child learns that the gift is hers and the love was a con. I didn't have those voices the first time. Not loud enough, not in time, and the lie grew unchecked until it was the whole shape of me. This time I made sure of them. This time I believed the right ones. I died the first time with a word I couldn't spell, and a gift I'd thrown away, alone and silent, my mother's voice giving me one last word into the dark. I intend to die the second time an old woman who spent her whole life spelling her best, with a shelf of books behind her and her mother's dictionary open on the desk and the people who love me close by. And if I have to die with a word in my mind, let it be one I spell true, in my mother's voice, the gift she gave me carried all the way to the end. Same word, both ends of two lives. The first time it was the phantom of everything I gave away, hanging unspelled in the dark. This time it's the real thing, everything I kept, spelled true and out loud in mine. And the only thing that ever stood between the two was a single word, the morning of a bee, spelled right at last by a small girl to the woman who told her to spell it wrong. No. That word cost me the hope of a love I'd been starving for my whole childhood, and it bought me back everything that hope had been holding hostage. The words, my mother's voice, my father, the life of a writer, the simple shattering fact of being loved without having to lose first. Given the same room, the same soft voice on the edge of my bed, the same promise of approval held out like bait, I would say it again 1,000 times.
No.
And then I'd walk to the microphone and listen for my mother's voice and spell my best, because the truest thing I know, the thing it took 2 lifetimes and a silent death to learn, is this: your gift is yours, and it does not have to be traded for love. They'll tell you that losing is generous, that dimming yourself is kind, that a good girl makes herself small so the favorite can shine. Don't believe them. Spell your best. Stand in the light. And the next time someone whose love you're starving for asks you to spell the word wrong on purpose, so someone with a better claim on them can lift the trophy, remember the child who obeyed once and died silent with the gift in a closet and the word unspelled. Then walk to the microphone and spell it true. So that's the whole of it. A motherless girl, a gift left in a dead woman's voice, a word spelled wrong on purpose to buy a love that was never for sale, and a single small word, spelled right at last, that split one life into 2. Spell your best. Keep your mother's gift. Let yourself be loved for the shining and not the losing. And let the word be true, because a word is a small perfect thing you can always carry, and no one can ever take it. Not a stepmother, not a grave, not 30 silent years. My mother told me that. She was right. I spell them true now, all the way to the end. In her voice, the gift she gave me carried home at last. And the little girl who spelled the word wrong on purpose, for a love that was never coming, she's at rest now, finally, fed and seen and loved, and she never has to spell it wrong again.